This is chapter 20, part A, on the immune system. So we'll look at the innate and adaptive body defenses. So the immune system is what's going to provide resistance to disease. So our bodies are constantly being exposed to bacteria, viruses, all sorts of pathogens and germs, but we don't stay sick all the time because of our immune system. So the immune system is made up of two branches. So we have the innate defenses, which are nonspecific. So these are going to make up the first and second lines of defense. Right? So innate means that it's inborn. Right? So you're born with it. You don't have to do anything. You automatically have it. So the first lines of defense include things like your surface barriers, so the skin and mucous membranes. The second line of defense includes the internal innate defenses, so things like antimicrobial proteins, phagocytes, fever response, inflammatory response. So pretty much the function of the second line of defense is just to prevent further spread. So if whatever pathogen makes it through the surface barriers, through that first line of defense of the skin or the mucous membranes, then we want to just try to contain it and quarantine it. Okay. So the second branch of the immune system is the adaptive defense system. So we'll talk about the adaptive defenses in part B, but it's going to be a specific immune response. So it's going to attack particular foreign substances. So because of this, it takes a little bit longer to react and have a response than the innate system. So the adaptive system includes your humoral immunity or your antibody immunity, which is governed by the B cells, and cellular immunity, which is governed by the T cells. So when we look at the immune system as an organ system, it's really more like a functional system. So there's not really organs per se involved that are only in this immune system. So these innate and adaptive defenses are intertwined. So they're going to release and recognize a lot of the same molecules, chemicals, and the innate defenses are able to kind of alert and notify the adaptive branch of any potential infections. All right, so like I said, part A, this section, we'll just look at the innate defenses, so kind of your inborn. Right? So the innate system uses the first and or second lines of defense to stop attacks by pathogens. So pathogen is just any type of disease-causing microorganism, so bacteria, fungi, viruses, parasites. So the surface barriers are composed of the skin and the mucous membranes, along with some of their secretions. So they're going to form kind of that physical barrier or a wall to most of these microbes. So the skin is filled with keratin, which is going to make the skin barrier more resistant to things like acids and bases, as well as some bacterial enzymes and toxins. And the mucosae that line the open body cavities are going to have similar mechanical barrier functions. So we said that the skin and mucous membranes can produce some protective chemicals to either inhibit or destroy these microorganisms. So one would be acid. So the skin is slightly acidic and has some mucus secretions to inhibit bacterial growth. So this is going to make up what's called the acid mantle of the skin. Different enzymes like lysozyme in saliva and respiratory mucus, lacrimal fluid, so your tears from your lacrimal glands, are also able to kill a lot of microorganisms. And then, of course, you have lots of enzymes and a very acidic environment in the stomach that can also kill those microorganisms. Mucin is another secretion, so it's a sticky mucus that's going to line the digestive and respiratory tracts to help trap any microbes that do happen to get in. So then in the respiratory system, it's also going to be ciliated. So any debris or pathogens that do get trapped in that mucus will be able to be kind of swept out of the respiratory tract and out of the body. Defensins are just some antimicrobial peptides that are going to inhibit microbial growth. And then there's just a few other chemicals and some secretions like sebum or the oil in your skin and dermacetin in sweat that can be toxic to some bacteria. So the respiratory system, like I said, also has some modifications to stop the spread of pathogens. So we have mucus-coated hairs in the nose, right, to trap any kind of inhaled particles. And then, like I mentioned, the cilia of the upper respiratory tract to sweep dust and debris back up toward the mouth. Okay. So as long as these surface barriers are unbroken, they're pretty efficient at keeping us protected. Right? But nicks or cuts that can break these surface barriers can trigger our second line of defense, our internal innate defenses. So the second line of defense is innate. Internal innate system is going to rely on things like cells and chemicals. So pretty much the whole underlying goal of our second line of defense is just to prevent further spread, right? So if it's gotten past our surface barriers, now we want to try to just contain it and prevent it from becoming a more systemic infection. So it'll use things like phagocytes, those large eating cells, natural killer cells. We also have the inflammatory response, antimicrobial proteins, and a fever response. So looking at some phagocytes first, or some eating cells. So these are just a type of white blood cell that's going to ingest or eat and digest foreign invaders. So the most abundant of the phagocytes are the neutrophils. So remember from the blood chapter where we listed the leukocytes in order of abundance, so never let monkeys eat bananas. So neutrophils were the most abundant of the white blood cells. But we want to have a high number of these cells because many of them are going to die kind of in battle fighting off these infections. So macrophages are another type of phagocyte. So remember from the blood chapter, again, these develop from the monocytes. Right? So these are the primary chief phagocytic cells. So that's pretty much their only job is to eat things. Right? So two different categories of macrophages. They could be free, meaning that they're free to kind of wander throughout the tissue spaces. And then there are some fixed macrophages that are permanently found in certain organs. So like some of those lymphatic organs we talked about in last chapter would have macrophages that kind of just permanently live in those tissues. So the process of phagocytosis, so when one of these eating cells is going to engulf a bacteria or a pathogen, so it's going to begin when the phagocyte recognizes a pathogen's carbohydrate signature. So kind of that glycocalyx, that sugar coat on the outside of the cell, or certain antigens. So later on we'll talk about how our immune system distinguishes self from non-self. So how does our immune system know what's my cells versus what's a bacterial cell? So there are certain characteristics on the surface of a cell to let these phagocytes know that it's not a self cell. So it's not my cell, it's some foreign cell that we have to deal with. So some bacteria and microbes have kind of evolved a counteract to our phagocytes by developing what's called a capsule that's going to kind of obscure and hide those surface markers. So it helps them kind of go undetected by the phagocytes. So the immune system uses a process called opsonization, where we have antibodies or certain proteins that are going to coat the pathogens. Right? So think of it as they act as handles for the phagocyte to grab onto. I like to think of it as we're basting the bacteria to make them more palatable for the phagocyte. So it's going to make the bacteria easier to eat for that cell. So the process of phagocytosis, so the macrophage or the phagocyte would kind of extend parts of its cytoplasm, forming a pseudopod or kind of a fake foot. So we engulf, kind of wrap around the pathogen to engulf it and bring it inside the cell and form what's called a phagosome. Okay, so now that we've brought the bacteria inside of the cell, right, in the phagosome, we can start to digest it. Right? So remember, lysosomes are our digestive organelles. They have lots of digestive enzymes, so they're kind of like the stomach of the cell. So now a lysosome is going to kind of fuse with this phagosome. So now it's exposed to those digestive enzymes. Right? So we can start to digest the cell and destroy the pathogen. So any leftover residual or indigestible waste is just going to be expelled through exocytosis. Natural killer cells are another cell involved in our second line of defense, although they are non-phagocytic. So they don't eat cells, but they can still kill cells. Right? So they can kill cancer and virus-infected cells, generally before the adaptive immune system is activated. So remember we said the adaptive system, since it is specific, it takes a little bit longer to have that response. So we have to kind of prepare our adaptive system. So while we're waiting for the adaptive immune system to kick in, we can have these natural killer cells to kind of try to maintain pathogen levels, keep them from multiplying too much. Right? So any cell that lacks that self marker is going to be marked as foreign and potentially pathogenic. So natural killer cells induce cell death by apoptosis in cancer cells and virus-infected cells. So apoptosis is essentially programmed cell death. So it releases chemicals that kind of hack into the pathogenic cell and pretty much tell it to self-destruct and kill itself. It can also secrete some enzymes called perforin, which forms a pore in the membrane of the pathogenic cell. So we can poke holes in the cell membrane and we can tell the cell to kill itself. It can also secrete some inflammatory chemicals to kind of enhance and increase our inflammatory response. So inflammation is going to be triggered whenever body tissues are injured. Right? So injuries could be due to trauma, heat, chemicals, or infection. But the major benefits of inflammation is it's going to help prevent the spread of those pathogens. It can dispose of any damaged cell debris or leftover pathogen parts. It can notify the adaptive immune system of what's going on, and it can begin to set the stage for tissue repair. Okay. So inflammation is tissue's response to injury. So there's 4 cardinal signs of acute inflammation. So we have redness, heat, swelling, pain, and sometimes loss of function can result. But that's usually caused by the pain and swelling from the other symptoms. Right? So if a body part is painful and swollen, it's going to be more difficult to use that body part. Right, so the 3 stages of inflammation include inflammatory chemical release, followed by a vasodilation with increased permeability, and finally a phagocyte mobilization. So essentially, once the tissue becomes injured or damaged, the injured cells will release kind of a chemical alarm. Right? So something like histamine. Right? So these chemical alarms act as vasodilators, so we're going to increase the blood flow to that tissue area. It's also going to increase the permeability of the vessels, so that way phagocytes can easily kind of squeeze out through the vessels and into the tissue space where the injuries occurred. Right? So any potential bacteria that are going to get into the wound, right, would be kind of right at that localized site of injury. So then the phagocytes are going to consume any cellular debris and pathogens so the tissue can heal. So we can't start healing this tissue and replacing these damaged cells until we clean up the accident. So some chemicals released by these injured tissues. Again, example would be histamine, some major inflammatory chemicals. So like if you have allergies, right, you take an antihistamine to reduce that inflammation and allergic response. There are some other inflammatory chemicals. You may see things like kinins, prostaglandins, complement, but they all share the same features in that they cause vasodilation and increase permeability of the capillaries. Right, so ultimately, we just want to increase the blood flow to the area so that way we can deliver more of these phagocytes and these immune cells. So vasodilation is going to cause hyperemia, meaning you'll have more blood in that tissue area, which leads to the symptoms of redness and heat. So increased capillary permeability would cause excess fluid, called exudate, to leak into the tissues, which is going to give us the swelling or edema symptom of inflammation. And then, of course, the swelling is going to push on the nerve endings in the tissue, resulting in the pain. So this is how we get those 4 cardinal signs of inflammation. So sometimes the pain can just be a result from the release of toxins from the bacteria. So a benefit to this edema and swelling is that that surge of fluid in the tissue is going to help sweep any foreign material or debris back into the lymphatic vessels for processing in the lymph nodes. So remember last chapter, lymphatic system, we talked about its ultimate function is to filter and clean the lymph fluid before we return it to the circulation. That increase in fluid to the tissue is also going to deliver more clotting proteins, so that way we can stop the bleeding much faster. So phagocyte mobilization is when the phagocyte, so say the neutrophils or the macrophages, arrive to the injured tissue area and how they go about cleaning up that injured space. So the first step is leukocytosis. So neutrophils are going to enter blood from the bone marrow, so we're going to increase our production of the neutrophils, the leukocytes. So then once they get near the injured tissue area, they're going to undergo what's called margination. So the endothelial cells that line the inside of the capillary vessels become inflamed in the injury, and that's going to allow them to grab onto the neutrophils more easily, make it more sticky. So essentially the neutrophils are going to line up along the edge of the blood vessel. So they're kind of line up along the margins, right? So like the margin of your paper is the edge of the paper. So they're going to line up on the edge or the margin of the blood vessel wall. So then step 3 is diapedesis. Okay? So dia means through or across. Pedesis means kind of like walk. So we're walking through. So these neutrophils are now going to squeeze through the endothelial cells of the blood vessel and move into the tissue space. So they're going to walk through that blood vessel wall. So then step 4 is chemotaxis. So all of the inflammatory chemicals that were released by the injured tissues are serving as kind of like a homing beacon for these neutrophils, so they know where they need to go. So they're following that scent, right, released by the injured cells. Okay, so just summarizing kind of general events of inflammation. So it's going to be a response to a tissue injury. Okay? So those injured tissue cells will release the inflammatory chemicals like histamine, kinin, prostaglandin. So ultimately, it's going to cause a vasodilation. So we have more blood flow to the area, which is going to cause that heat and redness. Okay? It can also increase the permeability of the capillaries, causing more fluids to leak into the tissues, which lead to our pain and swelling. Okay, so the swelling presses on the nerves and causes the pain. Okay. It's also going to attract more of those neutrophils and other immune cells to the area via chemotaxis. Okay. And then also the increase in blood flow and to the injured tissue area is going to also deliver more clotting factors. So we can also stop the bleeding and start to repair the injury. Okay. So that phagocyte mobilization, right? So they're going to migrate to that area. So as we've increased the blood flow to the area, we're going to bring more leukocytes. So once they reach the injured tissue area, they're going to line up along the capillary wall and then squeeze through via diapedesis into the tissue space. So now they're going to follow that chemical signal and start to clear up the dead tissue cells and any pathogens. So this would be where we may get the formation of pus. So pus is just a collection of dead neutrophils, dead tissue cells, and pathogens. And here's a little pus for your viewing pleasure. So another part of the second line of defense are antimicrobial proteins. So these are going to work to help enhance our other innate defenses by either attacking microbes directly or somehow hindering their ability to reproduce. So the most important categories of antimicrobial proteins we'll look at are interferons and complement proteins. So interferons are basically going to interfere with virus replication. Okay? So if a cell becomes infected with a virus, it will release these interferon chemical messengers to warn nearby neighboring cells that there's a virus. Right? So, hey, there's a virus in the neighborhood, lock your doors. Right? So the interferon is going to tell the neighboring cell to start producing antiviral proteins to attempt to block that virus from infecting that cell. Okay. So this is showing we have our virus that infects our initial host cell number 1. Okay. So kind of as its last dying breath, it's going to send out these interferon molecules to try to warn its neighbors. So the neighboring cells receive that interferon message. Right? That's going to turn on the genes for those antiviral proteins. Right? So as long as we can make the antiviral proteins in time, we'll be able to prevent the virus from infecting this cell. Right? So remember, interferons interfere with virus reproduction. Okay. The complement system consists of about 20 different proteins, but essentially it's going to complement some of the other immune responses. Okay. So its activation is going to enhance inflammation, and it can also directly destroy the bacteria. Okay. So again, it's just going to complement or enhance both the innate and the adaptive defenses. So you don't need to know all the different pathways, but end result is we can increase opsonization, so where we can kind of coat or baste those pathogens with tasty protein, so it makes it easier for the phagocyte to consume. We can enhance the inflammatory response, so we can stimulate more histamine release, we can increase vessel permeability, etc. And then the third potential result of the complement pathway would be this MAC. Right? So this is essentially where it's going to form pores in the target cell membrane, which can lyse and kill the target cell. So we can poke holes in the cell to try to kill it. So our last aspect of the second line of internal innate defenses is the fever. Right? So this is just an abnormally high body temperature. So of all of the innate defenses we've talked about so far, they're all pretty localized responses, right? So inflammation is just a localized response to the injury. Fever is a systemic response to infection, right? So it's a body-wide response. So, the hypothalamus is kind of the body's thermostat, so it determines what's an acceptable range of body temperature. So if we encounter an infection, those immune cells and macrophages are going to secrete a chemical messenger called a pyrogen. So pyro means fire, like a pyromaniac. So pyrogen is generating fire. So it's essentially going to turn the body's thermostat up and raise body temperature. So some benefits to moderate fever, it can cause organs like the liver and spleen to sequester certain minerals and nutrients like iron and zinc that the microbes need to reproduce. So if we kind of hold back all of those nutrients, we slow down their ability to reproduce. It can also increase the metabolic rate, which would increase the rate of repair. So it's going to increase the rate at which our cells are growing and dividing and replacing that damaged tissue. So again, this is just kind of showing the steps of a fever response. So we have a macrophage that encounters a bacteria. So the bacteria is going to be degraded by the macrophage, but in the process it can release some endotoxin, so that's going to have the macrophage release some of those inflammatory chemicals or some of those cytokines. Right? So cytokines are kind of like hormones of the immune system, where they're just chemical messengers. So we send these pyrogen messengers to the hypothalamus in the bloodstream. Right? So the hypothalamus is going to respond by resetting the body's thermostat to that higher temperature, resulting in the fever. Okay, so just to finish up with a summary of our second lines of defense with innate internal defenses. Right? So phagocytes were the eating cells, so things like neutrophils, macrophages. Okay? Natural killer cells are going to promote apoptosis or cell suicide, right? By directly attacking virus-infected cells. The inflammatory response is to help prevent spreading after a tissue injury. So we'll dispose of the pathogens and dead tissue cells and set the stage for repair. Okay, so the injured tissue cells are going to release those inflammatory chemicals like histamine that work as attractants for the phagocytes. So the phagocytes know where exactly they need to go. Okay. Antimicrobial proteins, the interferons and complement. Okay, so interferons are going to interfere with virus reproduction. Okay, so infected cells kind of warn neighboring cells to produce those antiviral proteins. Complement, like we said, is just going to kind of complement or enhance the other immune responses. So it can enhance phagocytosis and intensify the inflammatory responses. And then again, finally, fever was the systemic response. So it's a body-wide response that's going to be triggered by those pyrogen chemical messengers, right, that tell the hypothalamus to raise the body's thermostat.